Good evening, everyone. Welcome to your favorite 3M channel. Tonight, I'm especially glad to have this session with you guys tonight. First, because Becca is only the second female guest so far on the channel, but second, because we will be covering this very beautiful and important topic of biblical archaeology. But before we start with any of those, I would like to welcome Becca. And if you can please share some spiritual and theological stuff about you, like your background, education, stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Becca Leavell-Kizzia. I am currently a PhD candidate with the Lanier Center for Archaeology at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee. I live in the Houston area, but being in dissertation phase means that I can be more remote. Occasional trips to the wonderful city of Nashville or the Lanier the Lanier Library. They have wonderful archaeology books in Houston. So that's my educational background at this point. I do have a Master's of Arts in Archaeology and Biblical Studies, and that was from Southwestern Seminary. I do identify as a Christian. I've been raised mostly in the Southern Baptist tradition, but I have attended other churches as well. So I've had a diverse background spiritually. And my husband is currently serving as an associate pastor of family ministries at a church in the Houston area. So I help out a lot with that as well.
Yeah, that's very cool. I forgot who was the person. Maybe I think it was Joshua Sherman, our mutual friend, who months ago when I was mentioning this topic of archaeology, because I've been always loving archaeology. I remember when I was a young adult, and my former pastor back in Europe, he was asking me, "Hey, what's your plan about the future? What would you like to study?" And back then I didn't know what I would really like to do, but I remember telling him, well, archaeology sounds very cool because the movies and the excitement, what can you find and stuff. I never went that route, but still, I never lost that passion for archaeology and for just the excitement when someone would find some really cool artifact or something that would, especially if it's of great importance. And I remember when I was asking in our group, our ministry group on Facebook, we were just chatting, and I was like, "Hey, does someone know anyone who's studying or maybe even practicing archaeology?" And I remember when Joshua said, "Oh, I know this lady. I'll just introduce her to the chat." So even though it's been months before you came on the channel, I just want to say that I'm very thankful to have you in the group, especially because you and Carrie are the only ladies so far, and we cherish both of you. And with that being said, I would just like to start with tonight's session by asking you if you can please explain the difference for all the guests and for myself between archaeology and biblical studies, because so far what I understood from chatting with you is these are separate, but they're complementing disciplines.
Okay. Well, that does depend on who you ask. So I would say, think of it sort of as a spectrum. Over here you have biblical studies, and over here you have archaeology. And in the middle, the midpoint would be biblical archaeology. Now, I have some wonderful friends that would identify themselves as biblical archaeologists. And I've worked with a lot of people I respect that would also call themselves biblical archaeologists. I tend to see them as distinct, but I have my reasons, and I'll kind of go into that. So to use an analogy, I am a big fan of Shakespeare. I've gotten to see some Shakespearean plays, which I just love to do when I can. So if we think of a Shakespearean play, okay, archaeology would be all about the backdrop and the set design, the physical space that these actors are going to be acting in. But it's not about the actors. Well, it is, but it's about what are they doing with this space, okay? What are they doing with the props? What are the objects that they're interacting with? Okay. Biblical studies, on the other hand, is all about the script. You're reading the script, you're memorizing the script, you're analyzing the script, you're trying to make sure that you understand the script so that you can act it out in an appropriate way based on your interpretation of it. So where those two meet in the middle with biblical archaeology, you're concerned with both the script and the set design. You want to make sure that they're cohesive, that they're working together properly, and you're seeing the whole big picture of the play as a whole. Now, the reason why I see them as distinct is because you can use archaeology. It's a transferable skill set. So I have personally I've worked in Israel, I've worked in Cyprus, I've worked in Egypt. That was an epigraphy project, so it was a little bit different. I have also actually worked in my home state of Oklahoma, which was different because as a student, I've worked all around the world, but my first paid job was doing a survey in Oklahoma. So I'm like, that's literally 2 miles from where, or 2 hours away from where I grew up. So it was an interesting and ironic sort of thing. It's like travel the world, end up working at home. But I would just feel blessed that I got to do that. So archaeology, like you think again about the set design, you can design a set for Shakespeare and then turn around and next week you're doing Irving Berlin's White Christmas. And then the week after that, you could be doing Hamilton. It's like you can design any kind of set with this set of skills that you have. And that's why I see archaeology as separate, because I love working with biblical cultures, which would be like Israel and the surrounding areas. But if somebody says, hey, want to come work in Peru, I am all on board for that. Like I want to work at different points in the globe, different time periods, and the skill set that I am achieving should help me be able to do that. So that's why personally I prefer to see it as separate. And my PhD, when I finish it, is going to be a PhD in archaeology.
Wow, that's so cool. I didn't plan to ask this question because I didn't know about all these adventures you've been to. But from all those 3 or 4 different areas where you said you've been around the world and doing actually the job of the archaeologist, can you please tell us what was your favorite location and why? What did you do?
Ooh. Oh my gosh, that is all right. Let me think for a second here. I'm going to have to say, as much as I worked for 2 summers in Israel. I loved it. Every Christian should go once. Every Christian should go at least once in their lifetime to Israel. But I'm going to have to say I have enjoyed working in Cyprus the most because I've been there 3 times. It's like the island calls me back, The site where my team worked in Cyprus is Korion. It's on the southern coastline near Limassol, if anybody knows where that is. And it was a late Roman city, and it was built on top of a very steep cliff. So we, of course, had to be careful of the cliff. But there's this wonderful view from the top of the cliff. So you'd be like working in the dirt, getting all sweaty and dusty and just tired. And then you look up and just this gorgeous vista of the Mediterranean, like for miles. And every day working up there and looking out and seeing that, it's just, you're struck, like, even though you're tired, you're like, I can't believe I get to be here. Like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So yeah, I have to say Cyprus, yes. I hate to break it to every other team that I've worked with, but yeah, my heart's in Cyprus. At least
Yeah,
for now.
that's exciting. Hopefully, you'll have more chances to work in, like you said, you're open to some other areas in the future, and that will be amazing for you, not just to expand your knowledge, but also to put your hands in the dirt again and maybe be one of the, maybe not pioneers, but maybe someone who discovers something important that we can one day say, hey, this is Becca from the channel. We know her, good for her.
Yeah,
Wow.
no.
Okay. So if a regular churchgoer churchgoer, the person who is just attending the church, but is not maybe so much into intellectual stuff, studies, academics, books. If you would talk to them, um, and they'll be like curious, like, okay, what's such a big deal with archaeology? I mean, yeah, it can be helpful in their mind, but like, it's not maybe something that much important for them. I would disagree strongly. How would you tell them gently, but still in the spirit of the truth? How would you tell them why is archaeology important for the regular Christian?
Okay, that is a very big question. I would say, going back to that analogy of the Shakespearean play, you can absolutely have a Shakespearean play with just a bunch of plainclothes actors in a room, like they're all wearing jeans and t-shirts, and they're doing the lines from Shakespeare, and maybe they're getting the right, tone and setting the right emotion. But if it's just an empty room and they're all just in jeans and t-shirts, it's not the full experience of Shakespeare that people usually expect, right? You want to have these gorgeous over the top Elizabethan costumes, and you want to have, maybe a castle in the background, and, and how are you going to have Macbeth if you don't have, Lady Macbeth clutching the dagger, So you need all these details to fill out and enrich the experience of this Shakespearean play, or else it's just a bunch of people quoting Shakespeare in their blue jeans, So I feel like people don't realize what they're missing out on because their experience has been that group of people in blue jeans quoting Shakespeare. We don't realize what we don't know. And the more you dig into the world of archaeology and find out more about the background, and it introduces this whole new dimension of just color and texture. And then you start learning about, well, what did people wear? What did they eat? It humanizes the biblical characters to where they're not just some people walking around with towels on their heads like you see in like the children's ministry play. They're actual people that had real experiences, and we can relate to them more on the basis of that. So I don't know. Every archaeologist I've ever known is like this huge nerd or geek or however whatever term they prefer. But we all just, oh my gosh, why aren't people more excited about this? And so sharing that passion is part of our passion, really. And there are some great people that are trying to do that in the world.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I wish more people see it that way. As someone who loves both archaeology um, and apologetics as one of the branches of theology, I see them so much powerful working together, and I see them as both tools to strengthen someone's faith, especially when someone is dealing with doubts, has a lot of questions. Um, do you share the same frustration as I do when people have available so much data, even without them buying so much books or going to school, spending time and money, but still a lot of good articles and good YouTube videos are available online for free. Yet people are not, and I'm saying about people in the churches, they're not much interested to learn and grow and get these answers. And I know in my mind, I'm always curious. I always have questions. That's why I want to dig to get more answers. And usually what I learn is that the answers, one, when I learn them for myself, are very beneficial for me in the future when I'm talking with someone who is in dire need of those answers, but they didn't know, like you said. So maybe did you experience that you maybe in your church or in other churches that you will see a dire need for archaeology to be known more, to be spread more, that people be acquainted at least with most important archaeological data coming both from the Old Testament and New Testament, yet they don't even think about learning. They don't care about investigating.
Well, it's interesting that you've had that experience because my experience has been completely opposite to that, especially in the church we're currently serving at. People here in our church are so hungry for the truth. Like they want to dig deep into scripture. They want to access everything it has to offer them. And if archaeology is a means to understanding it better, then they are absolutely going to want to know more about it. So our senior pastor just recently retired, but before he did, his wife and I, we co-led a Bible study for the adults on Wednesday nights. And it was very ambitious. It was a 12-week Bible study, and it was the background of the Old Testament in 12 weeks. It was a lot of research, but I loved it. I know Miss Sandy loved it as well. And how we did it was, again, that distinction between archaeology and biblical studies. She handled the biblical studies side of things. And I contributed a little bit because, I do have my master's kind of co-divided into biblical studies as well. But I handled the archaeological side of it. And it's been amazing to me to see, and these are full-grown adults. Some of them are, old enough to be my grandparents, and they are learning for the first time about different discoveries that have been made over the last 100 years, really, and some of them within the last 20 years that have a major effect on how we understand the world of the Bible. And so it was so exciting. It was such a privilege to be a part of that. We may end up, and like I said, our senior pastor has retired. So there is talks, though, with our discipleship team about possibly doing a study over the background of the New Testament in the future. So we're still in the works on that, but hopefully soon.
I have to tell, I envy you and your experience about people being surrounded by people who crave for knowledge and appreciate knowledge. I believe we desperately need, well, one of the things the global church needs, that it's more it's more knowledge and more truth. By the way, when you did your this background study for the Old Testament, and that you may also do for the New Testament, as an archaeologist, do you find yourself more in, I won't say more in love, but do you find yourself more passionate like studying the Old Testament era or the New Testament?
Oh, that is a good question. So that was actually a question I faced the first year I started my master's program, because a lot of people had done archaeology during their undergrad, at least as like a concentration or something. I hadn't. And my college degree, my bachelor's degree, I actually started out in nursing school, and then after a year, I changed my major to Christian ministry and got my bachelor's in that. And the only reason I can give you for why I changed my major was God called me to. I just felt led to. Everyone was a little bit shocked because nursing is a wonderful profession. I truly do believe it is a ministry, but it wasn't the ministry I was being called to. And so I was doing okay in my classes. I was keeping up with the work, but it just wasn't where my heart was at. And so I spent a summer before I went into my sophomore year of college praying about, Lord, where do you want me? And it became very apparent within a couple of weeks that I was being led to join the ministry program instead. And the advisor for that program actually made me go home and pray about it for another week before he helped me file the paperwork to change my major. But once I got into studying ministry, you use a perfect expression. I fell in love with the background of the Bible. I started seeing where if people could just understand the historical context and the social context as well, but if they can understand the background of the Bible more, that would clear up a lot of the modern day heresies that we see. I won't start naming names because I don't want to step on people's toes, but we do have some problems in the church where we're misunderstanding the biblical text. And a lot of that can be cleared up by just understanding the context in which the Bible was written, which that's where you come in with biblical archaeology. And I know some wonderful friends that, that's their jam, that's their thing. And I'll be happy to recommend some resources here later. But so that led me into, in my senior year of college, I got to thinking about, man, I love this archaeology stuff. It's so fascinating. I'm so excited about it. Why don't I do that? Like, I started the ministry program not knowing. Everyone's like, well, you're studying ministry. Are you going to preach? And I was like, I don't think so. I mean, I grew up Southern Baptist. That's not really a thing in Southern Baptist world. I was like, I mean, if God calls me to do that, then I guess, but I don't know. And so I started again thinking and praying and talking to some people, and I ended up enrolling in the archaeology program at Southwestern Seminary. And I talked to Dr. Stephen Ortiz, who's one of the professors there, and he wanted me to come on my very first dig before I started my master's degree, for a very practical reason, because you can enjoy archaeology in books all day long, but until you're actually in the field doing the work, getting hot and sweaty and dusty, you don't know, are you going to like that side of it? So before you spend, thousands of dollars to get a very expensive education, you should maybe see if you like it in real life. And it was a wonderful point. I went to Israel in 2013 for the first time ever. First ever dig. I absolutely loved it. I worked with some amazing people on that team. Ended up coming back 2 years later, worked with the same team, plus some new faces, because archaeology is always changing with new students graduating and coming in. But Tel Gezer was the site that I worked on, and wonderful, rich site. It's within the Old Testament time frame, so that was actually my first experience with archaeology. And I just fell in love with it, and I never looked back. And then later, so everybody, once I started the archaeology program, they're like, "Are you Old Testament or New Testament?" And I was like, "Do I have to pick one? Are you sure?" So I ended up just basically, I wrote my master's thesis on the late Roman period, so like immediately post Constantine, like that era. But in my heart, I'm just like, I love both. And I've worked in both areas, and I would be happy to work, I've worked in the Iron Age, and I've worked in the late Roman period. I would love to do early Roman. I would love to do late Bronze. If I could work on a medieval site, I'll do that. I just love the field. It's fun. So to answer your question, there's not one that I prefer over another. They're both different. It's kind of like asking which of my kids, I love more. I got two, and it's like I love them both. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair and honest answer, and I respect that. I don't know what I would say either. I remember when I was a new believer, I'm ashamed to admit that now, but a little over 20 years ago, I found Old Testament super boring, and I didn't want to read it. I was just reading New Testament over and over again, and then you see later what you were missing on, and you're like, well, I was ignorant. But when it comes to the archaeology, just as a as an evidence that I love archaeology, in my Christian urban fantasy action novel that I'm writing, there is this archaeologist who is a big character in the novel. He's playing a big role, and I'm saying that because I planned with that novel. It's not so much about like making money or whatever, but especially in Europe, there is a lack of Christian fictional authors. I know there are more of them in the States, but still, it cannot be too much, if you ask me, because we are bombarded more with secular stuff. So my goal is like, okay, God, the same with the YouTube channel or with the novel. I love both of them maybe equally, just like you like your kids. And I would like God, you to give me favors so that one day I can use both to glorify you. So I was just about to ask you because, in my novel, there is an archaeologist and you do archaeology. You already mentioned that archaeology is a powerful tool to strengthen the faith of the believers, but also help non-believers if they have questions like how can you prove some stuff from the Bible. So in that regard, in that spirit, can we say that archaeology is actually or can be and should be used as a tool to glorify God?
Oh, that is a good question. I keep saying that a lot. You have a lot of good questions. How can we use it? So for starters, if you're studying the time frame in which the biblical events happened, so that would be depending on your chronology, anywhere from, well, okay, we're not entirely sure what to call the time period of Genesis. Let's put it that way. Once you get to like Abraham, things start correlating more with other outside documents. And so it's easier to tell, okay, what time period are we talking about here? So, are we talking Neolithic, Paleolithic? Genesis is its own thing, and it's not something that I really go deeply into because there's a lot we don't know yet. And I say yet because we may know more in the future. But when we talk about like Abraham can be fairly securely dated to the Middle Bronze Age. There's elements in the text that would seem to indicate that he's within that frame of reference. So anywhere from the Middle Bronze Age all the way through the Roman period, that's kind of considered the biblical archaeology window per se. By studying the artifacts and the buildings, because artifacts are basically, you can, it's like this ink pen, you can pick up and hold it and carry it around, but the buildings obviously are different. So by studying all of that, though, it helps, like I said, it fleshes out the story a little bit more, so you get more of an idea of, okay, so what was it like during Solomon's time, during David's time, and so forth. So it adds details to the story, but also there are some things that are very, very mysterious when you get deeper into the biblical text. For example, one point of controversy for Abraham is that it mentions camels a couple times in the patriarchal period. And there has been some pushback from skeptics saying, well, obviously the Bible is wrong because camels weren't domesticated in Israel until much later. All right. Well, I read an article recently where this one scholar found out that if you pay close attention to the narrative, they're not being domesticated in Israel. Abraham is getting camels from outside Israel, like in Egypt or Mesopotamia, which they were domesticated there much earlier. So, okay, that introduces historical plausibility to that part of the text. So different things like that, when people are like, wait, the Bible's wrong about this. Okay, be patient, just as be aware that we're still learning. Archaeology is this process of continuous learning, and a lot of that is based on the nature of stratigraphy, which is the study of the layers in the soil. If you think about archaeology as a layer cake, what part of the layer cake do you put on last? Like, it's the top one, right? So that bottom layer is the one you lay down first, and then all the other layers get stacked on top of it. So what that means is that very top layer that we're digging into, that's the latest stuff that we're going to find. So, for example, at Tel-Gezer, the latest period that we find stuff from is Hellenistic and Roman. The further down you dig, the later in time you go, or the earlier in time you go, pardon me. So we're just now, the dig had been going on, it's closed now, it's in publication phase. But after 10 years, they were starting to get down to the Bronze Age levels. And there were some areas where they'd already reached there, but it's not like, you don't excavate like this, you kind of zigzag a little bit. But it takes a while to get down to older stuff. So if we're talking about a site that's been occupied for thousands of years, it's going to take a while to get down to like the middle bronze, the early bronze. Like it takes time. And so as we're digging deeper and deeper and deeper at these long occupational sites, we're finding out earlier and earlier stuff. So that helps us, it's like we're working backwards in time through the Old Testament. You start with the Persian period, you go back to, the Iron Age, and then so on and so forth, like further back in time until maybe eventually we will know a lot more about the world of Genesis. For right now, we have some Sumerian documents that can help us out, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but that's because Sumerian stuff it's been dug more than some of the older stuff in Israel has. So that's just where we're at right now.
Well, thank you for such a detailed answer. And correct me if I'm wrong, archaeology is not an ancient science. So, as a relatively new science, it takes time, and there's a lot of areas that are still that needs to be undug, and there are still archaeologists needed on the field. There are resources that need to be provided for all these expeditions. And in some countries in the Middle East, you can't just as a Westerner go and just dig. There's so much. They have wars, politics. They may hate Western society, scientists. They may not allow them to dig. So there are all these problems when it comes to finding data. We will all love to wake up tomorrow and to have all the answers found, but I think we need patience with archaeology, right?
Yes, absolutely. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of political stuff that can get in the way of archaeology. For example, there are a lot of archaeological sites that need to be investigated in the northern Sinai, but several years ago when ISIS was active in the area, you can't dig when there are terrorists there. So that presented a problem. And I know a lot of my Egyptologist friends were just like, man, can we get this resolved and just go back to the work that we love to do? But that's one of the hazards of archaeology is you have to be careful. And if you look at, there's some wonderful stories from the early days of archaeology about different archaeologists working around the world, and then World War II breaks out. Okay, so now what? And so there's one archaeologist, McFadden, was in Cyprus when World War II broke out. He had a friend that was, I can't remember if it was mainland Greece or Italy, but a lady friend of his was suddenly trapped as the Axis powers are moving into her area. McFadden takes his sailboat and goes to rescue her. So they end up having a cruise of several weeks on the Mediterranean, which nobody knows what happened between the two of them on the Mediterranean. But he safely rescues her. They go their separate ways. And then he ends up being a gun runner for the Allies with his little sailboat that he had in Cyprus. So that's just an example of how, if you're an archaeologist and you're working in all these different areas, sometimes you've got to make that choice. Do I get swept up in the events, or do I get myself safely home and wait it out? So that's one of the decisions that you have to make in these sort of situations. And I have had friends, 2014, that was the year that my husband James and I got married. And so I missed the dig season that year. And my friends were over in Israel, and they were messaging me and telling me that there were rockets flying over their heads, but they still decided to go and get ice cream anyway. And I'm like, wow, I knew you guys liked ice cream, but wow.
Yeah, sounds like me. I love ice cream. I love the story that you said about that gentleman. I wish they make a movie or at least write a novel after him. That sounds better than any, well, almost like Indiana Jones, but better than any
Yeah.
James Bond or whatever action movies popular now.
They should. Like maybe you and I could team up and write it. We'll see. But
Yeah,
there actually
yeah.
is a good movie on, I believe it's on Netflix now. I just was looking at my notes over here. It's called The Dig with Ralph Fiennes and Carey Mulligan. That is actually based on a true story of the Sutton Hoo excavation in 1938. I watched that, and not to give any spoilers if anybody wants to watch it, but I do feel like it's a pretty good representation of what archaeology was like in the 1930s. Now, of course, because it's, Hollywood stuff, they got to tweak it a little bit, add in some romance and whatever. But there's this moment, and just to show how the methodology has changed. So when you're excavating, you're usually digging in like a square hole in the ground, basically, and we call it a square or a trench, depending on what area you're working in. The sides are called balks. The walls of dirt that you're making as you dig down are balks. And there is a time in the movie where, so when the soil dries out, balks can become unstable. So you have to weigh that risk, record the data, and carefully lower them as you go. So you don't have like 20-foot balks in your square, because that can collapse. So there's a moment where he's excavating, and I'm looking and I'm like, oh no, those balks are too high. Oh no, that's bad methodology, which was a problem because, when archaeology has really only been around for about a century, give or take, methodology was kind of trial and error, especially in those early decades. So I'm watching this and I'm thinking, oh no, his balks are too high. And then the balks collapse. And I'm like, oh, I told you, what the heck, dude? So yeah, but that is exactly what used to happen in the early days of archaeology. They tried something, it didn't work. Now we know to do it better next time. And you hope that nobody is like badly injured in the process. But that has happened too. So yeah, you just try and be careful as you're in this great process of learning.
Yeah, I didn't plan saying, but something you mentioned just made me connect this. And you would also hope that they're not like all these amateur
Yeah.
archaeologists or people who are like grave robbers, who we
Yes.
don't see them just in movies. They're real threat. They do the same thing back home because Serbia has a lot of
Mhm.
really ancient archaeological
Mm.
diggings. But I believe that happens all around the world because people are trying to find some, ancient artifacts and just sell them on the black market to feed their families, take advantage. And by doing that, they do great damage for the whole world, for the whole culture of the
Mhm.
world. But not just that, I read that sometimes they would permanently destroy artifacts that are there in the ground, and then archaeologists would come the next day and see just remains of something that was so precious and priceless.
Mhm.
And I'm not archaeologist, but I can only imagine their disappointment and frustration once
Yeah.
when they come on the field and this is their job. They put so much effort into that, and someone
Mhm.
comes who doesn't care. They just want to sell it, steal it, and sell it, and
Yeah.
no one appreciates their work. So that must be another layer of frustration that archaeologists are dealing with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, this has always been a problem. We do have evidence that grave robbing in particular has been a problem since the time of the pharaohs themselves. So, you have a certain pharaoh that maybe he's been dead for a few decades. You already know that he's going to have all these treasures in his tomb. So they would raid that guy's tomb. I mean, and we're talking, this is stuff that's happening in ancient times. So that has always been a problem. One of the chief problems when it comes to archaeology, even if these looters come in and they preserve the artifacts that, maybe it's some beautiful pottery, let's say, maybe they take that and they sell it on the black market, and it eventually gets bought back by a museum or a university. Now the problem is it's out of context. And we talk a lot in biblical studies about context of scripture. You know, you don't want to just yank a verse out of its textual context. But the same is true for archaeology, because like I mentioned, that layer cake, the place where artifacts are found is every bit as important as the artifacts themselves. Because if it's sealed in one of these layers, then we have a better chance of trying to securely date, okay, what time period is this from? And some of this is so sophisticated, you can even say it's within these first few decades of this century, okay? Sometimes you can even get within like a 15 to 20 year time range, depending on what the artifact is. Now, a lot of times, especially the further back you go, it's not always that accurate. But when you get into later periods and you have a coin, oh my gosh, that has the date on it, you know? So that is a very exciting thing. And then that coin can help securely date everything around it if it's in that sealed context. So sticking with the cake analogy, imagine that you have a layer cake that somebody made for a birthday party. And somebody comes along and just sticks their finger right in the middle of it, but then decides, I'm going to cover it up with icing so nobody knows. Well, once you cut into that cake, you're going to know, because here's this whole dip that is just icing. And it's the same is true with archaeology. You can see if a later pit was dug by like a looter, a grave robber, or even just, you know, with these tell sites, they're occupied for so long that, well, somebody has to dig a basement or a storage pit or a well or a kiln. You're going to dig down into the ground, obviously. But in doing so, you're going to destroy what's buried there. So it's very interesting. I actually helped remove a Hellenistic kiln that was dug into some of the Iron Age layers at a site that I worked at. And it happens. It's life. But this is why we keep such careful track of those layers in the soil, and like when the texture or color changes or the type of artifacts change, because we need to know, okay, what time period are we dealing with here? So if there is a change all of a sudden, like you've got a Roman coin where you expected only Iron Age pottery, what's going on there? You got to find out. You even have to take into account, it might have been a rodent burrow that went through your site. And he's like, oh, shiny coin, I'm going to take it home to my little nest. So you have to keep track of these things. And when you do have people who are, you know, at the most generous, let's say it's an amateur who doesn't know what they're doing, and they just decide, hey, this is cool stuff, I'm going to dig it up. Without documenting those subtle changes in the soil and the other finds that, you know, if you find a broken pot, that's not that exciting to the average person. Oh, it's broken, it's trash, whatever. Depending on what it is, archaeologists could be like, oh my gosh, you know, this is really something cool. And that's something that the average person wouldn't know unless they've had the training to recognize it. So the best thing that, let's say you're out with your metal detector and you find something that you think could be archaeologically significant, find an archaeologist and talk to them and see if, you know, it could just be, you know, old scrap metal, or it could be something really important that we need to handle carefully.
I was wondering, let's say you find something in your backyard, or I find something. According to the American law, are you allowed to keep it for yourself, or you have to submit it to the authorities?
Okay, that is where it gets tricky. And I'm trying to remember the exact laws, because part of the problems with working overseas so much, it's like, I can tell you what the laws there are. All right. It depends on the nature of the artifact. I grew up in Oklahoma, and we would occasionally find arrowheads on our property. I grew up on a farm. Every time, you know, there's a heavy rain or my dad would plow the field, we would occasionally find arrowheads. If something like that is found on your property, you know, and it's you're tilling your garden and it turns up an arrowhead, I'd say that you're probably safe enough to keep it. Although if you do have a local museum or something, you might want to contact them and be like, hey, is this something, you guys would be interested in finding out more about? Because you can show them, hey, I found it exactly over here. And they can see, is it likely that it just, got dropped there and that's the only thing there is? Or could there be a larger site that maybe they would want to investigate? So as kind of a courtesy, I would recommend doing that. And that's here in the US, granted. Now, it gets much more interesting if you find human remains. That is where you absolutely want to find your local archaeologist and or law enforcement. This actually happened, this exact scenario happened when I was about 10 years old, about 2 miles down the road from where I lived at that point in time. There was a company that was doing some excavation with a bulldozer, and they found a human skeleton. And that freaked everybody out because it's a small farming community. Everybody knows everybody. They've all been in the same area for like 3 generations, if not more. And they're like, oh no, do we have a murderer in our midst? All of a sudden it's an Agatha Christie novel. And so of course, law enforcement was called in and they investigated, and they found out that this was actually a Native American burial site that they had accidentally, they had no idea it was there. They turn it up with their heavy machinery, and now what? Well, there is this thing, there's a law called NAGPRA that was enacted in 1990, I believe. So pretty much right before they discovered this skeleton down the road from my house. And what that is it ensures that Native burial sites are handled with respect and that the remains are repatriated to the tribe. Depending on the nature of the site, the tribe may want to rebury those human remains in that same location, or considering this was like a construction site, they may want to move it to a more secure location that is associated with that tribe. But it's all about being culturally respectful to the Native American tribes in the area. So it was just fascinating because at that point I was like about 10 years old. I loved watching PBS documentaries, but archaeology as a career hadn't occurred to me and wouldn't for several years. But now looking back, I'm like, yeah, that's cool. Now I know the process that they would have had to do to handle that respectfully. And so my community handled it well. It could have been much worse. So they did the right thing.
Yeah, that's cool. I have another new interesting question, hopefully interesting for you as well.
Okay.
Here in Chicago, we have Oriental Museum, and I went there several years ago with my friend, and I plan to go again so I can, if I'm allowed, to take some videos and post on the channel for everyone who loves it. And because I didn't plan to ask this question because I didn't even think about it, I know that they have some Babylonian, one of those creatures. They're huge and they're winged, but they're like a combo of different creatures, different animals.
Yeah, a cherub or
yes,
cherub.
but also in Babylonian version in their mythology, they'll be called, I think, differently. So I don't know. I couldn't remember the original name, but anyway, at least you know what I'm thinking about.
Yes.
So when you see those glorious findings, it took so much time to create them, to make them, to excavate them, to clean them, to bring them here. I'm thankful I can see those things. They're old, thousands of years, and I don't have resources nor time to visit every country in the world and go see those things, but I'm glad that they're available locally. So I just want to ask you, what kind of archaeologist are you? Are you the archaeologist who would kind of encourage local museums to keep the artifacts that don't belong to them? Or you're a type of archaeologist that would encourage museums and authorities, hey, even though this is beautiful and even though it's so beneficial that we can go maybe 10, 15, 20 miles, see what belongs to the Middle East, or from, in that regard, from any part of the world that is available locally and that is old for thousands of years. So even though we appreciate that benefit, but it belongs to that civilization, to that country, to their
Mhm.
culture, to their people. What kind of archaeologists are you? Would you encourage museums and local authorities to keep these things that actually don't belong to us, or would you be more satisfied, inside of you knowing, hey, they return now to
Mhm.
their homeland, they
Mhm.
belong to their people, so now
Mhm.
it's kind of their legacy.
Yes. That is a complicated question. And we talked about this a lot in my classes about post-colonialism. And first, I think we have to understand how some of these Middle Eastern and ancient Near Eastern artifacts ended up in America and Britain and Germany and France, all these other museums. We have to understand the history of the excavations. So, as you know, after World War II in particular, a lot of the Western countries were controlling what were the remains of the Ottoman Empire. So, like Syria and Israel and all these areas were under the control of the Western nations instead of the Ottomans, because the Ottomans, they sided with the Axis and then their empire fell. So, because of that, in those areas controlled by the British or the French, um, when they were excavating, if the British are excavating, they put the finds in the British Museum. If the French are excavating, they put the finds in the Louvre or another museum. So, which I got to see the Louvre last summer, and it was fantastic. I loved it. But still jealous that you got to see Chicago. Of course you would get to, because it's right there, but it's like I haven't been to see the museum in Chicago yet, so that's definitely one of my it's on my bucket list. Hopefully sooner rather than later. But yes, so the reason why these artifacts ended up in Western museums to begin with was because of colonialism. Fast forward a couple of decades, and after World War II, when a lot of these occupied areas became independent nations, well, now we've got Israel becoming its own nation. We've got Cyprus and Syria and all these areas becoming independent of those colonial powers. And they're establishing their own national museums. And as they are developing these resources to take care of their own history and the artifacts associated with it, they start wanting these items back, which is completely understandable. So, in light of that, I would think that it's up to the museum that owns the piece and the country of origin to decide, well, what is the best place for this really? Is it a very delicate item that maybe the country of origin isn't prepared to handle yet? Maybe in another 10 years, they'll have the resources to be able to conserve this very delicate artifact. Or is it something that it can definitely travel, it's safe, it's stable, and it can be sent back if the country of origin wants it? If so, then that's up to that museum and or university to handle that situation. Again, coming from Oklahoma with my familiarity with NAGPRA and the Native American tribes there, I personally tend to be on the side of the countries of origin when they have the resources to handle the artifacts. And that's up to their discretion to know whether or not they can. Some of the museums just, they're just starting, they're not sophisticated perhaps enough to handle like these very delicate items. And that's up to them and their conservators, excuse me, to be able to make that judgment call. But just like with NAGPRA, if the native tribes or the country of origin wants those items back, they should have them back. That does get a little risky if they're in a country that tends to experience a lot of war or a lot of civil unrest. We saw with when Baghdad was taken by the American troops, the Baghdad Museum got looted that was a problem. Now, fortunately, a lot of the local people, I think their intention, I can't speak for what their thought process was, but a lot of those items did end up being returned, but not all of them. So that is an issue that can happen in countries that tend to experience a lot of war and unrest. So again, though, it's their country, it's their museum, it's their cultural heritage, and it's up to them to decide, can we handle this or not? And if they decide that they can and then they're wrong, it's still their heritage. It's up to them. So as an archaeologist, it hurt me to my soul when Palmyra got blown up by ISIS. And I have so many people that they were just outraged. It was a dark day for all of us when Notre Dame caught fire. But at the same time, this is why we keep such meticulous records of everything. This is why we write everything down. We photograph, we do sketches, we preserve the data from the site and all the artifacts in case something happens to them later. Because you never know. Nobody could have predicted that ISIS was going to blow up Palmyra like that. But the fact that certain sites in these war-torn areas, if they've been documented correctly, not everything is lost. Yes, it's still a tragedy. Yes, it would be like if something, God forbid, happened to the Sphinx or the pyramids. That would be irreplaceable. But at least we would still have the data where it's been studied. And so that's why we keep good records, we have good databases, and we publish our findings. That is so important because there have been cases, especially with the early days of archaeology, where they didn't publish their findings fast enough. And then one of my favorite archaeologists to learn about, Roland DeVoe, he excavated at Qumran, which is associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he died before he finished his publication of his work. So now we have his notes. Well, not me personally, but France has his documents from that excavation, but it hasn't been made available to the public yet. And that is a tragedy that hopefully will get rectified sooner or later. But that's France. He was a French archaeologist. France is in charge of this. So hopefully they can find a solution sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's funny how you just mentioned Dead Sea Scrolls, and I was just about to ask you about it. In your career, but not just career, even before you started doing archaeology, I mean, studying and doing it as a profession, anything you saw in person or anything you read about, what would you, as an archaeologist who is a Christian, a woman of God, say that? Can you name a few findings that were like the most important for our Christian faith? And there, I would assume that will be the Dead Sea Scrolls regarding the Old Testament, or when it comes to the Old Testament. I mean, when it comes to the New Testament, I would say that also one of those findings, like in old basilicas, where they will find inscriptions that Jesus is mentioned as God, because the skeptics would sometimes attack Jesus. Well, not sometimes, but many times they would attack Jesus' divinity by saying, well, this is a later invention. Jesus was never seen as a God by his early followers and the early church. So I would assume this is also important. But according to you personally, can you please just name few or several most important findings we found, in archaeology when it comes to our faith?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say obviously the Dead Sea Scrolls, because as I'm sure you've studied at Moody, up until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we really didn't have very early manuscripts for the Old Testament. So once the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and they predate Christianity for the most part, I think there are some that are kind of contemporary with the New Testament times, but most of them are like older, based on the I think they did carbon dating on some, but they also look at the style of the lettering on the scrolls. So Dead Sea Scrolls, you know, that's like King Tut for the archaeology and biblical studies side of things. So Dead Sea Scrolls, definitely important. I would also have to point to the Dura Europos Church, which is found in Syria. It's believed to be the earliest Christian church that's yet been found. And it dates to the 3rd century, which everyone who, sometimes people say things and don't realize how misinformed they are. I've heard very well-intentioned, passionate people who, they don't agree with Christianity. And so they're like, well, Constantine just made it all up. And I'm like, yes, but what about the Dura Europos Church that predates Constantine? It's like, it's before he was even born. Or wait a minute, I might have to check my chronology, but it dates to the 3rd century before the Edict of Milan and so forth. So yeah, that is a very important one that is not as well known by everyone, but it should be. Let's see, what would be another one? The Merneptah Stela is a very important one. I actually got to see that at the Cairo Museum. I was just geeking out. But it contains what is believed to be the earliest mention of Israel in any of the extra biblical literature. So it's very important. Also kind of helps us secure the date of the Exodus, although that, of course, is under debate. Let me think what else. There's so much. Let's talk about something personally that I've interacted with. I did a study. I partnered up with one of my fellow students, and we helped do an inventory of some Roman and Hellenistic coins that the seminary had. And I handled the Hellenistic Hashmonean coins, and he handled the Roman coins because that's his thing. He loves the Roman era. So I spent a whole semester working with these Hashmonean coins, which, if you're familiar with the Hashmonean dynasty, that connects to the Maccabees and the story of Hanukkah. And so it's a fascinating time period. I had a lot of fun researching that time period. But what was fascinating for me was seeing the coins of Alexander Janaeus, where he uses what's called Paleo-Hebrew instead of what was the modern Hebrew of his time, which had been influenced by Aramaic. It's very distinctive, like the difference if you see them side by side. The Hebrew of that time period is more of the square letters. It's very similar to what modern Hebrew looks like now. It's, you see it, it's Hebrew. Paleo-Hebrew is much closer to some like the Canaanite inscriptions that we see. It is much more angular and irregular a little bit. And I'm sure someone somewhere is like, don't describe it in those terms. All of my text critic friends are probably having a fit right now, but I'm just trying to think of, how to describe it visually. But Alexander Janaeus made the decision to use Paleo-Hebrew on his coinage for a very important reason. Because he himself, he was not a descendant of David. He was not even from the tribe of Judah. The Maccabees were Levites. And so when he decided to call himself king, and he was not from the tribe of Judah or the lineage of David, or as they would put it in his time, as son of David, everyone kind of lost their mind a little bit. So by using the Paleo-Hebrew that would have been in use at the time of King David himself, he's basically saying, hey, I'm identifying with David, though. Like, look at me. I might not be his descendant, but I still am closely tied to this period of time that we remember as the Israelite Golden Age, or they did at that point in time. So he's sending a political message by using their own history. And getting to hold these coins carefully, of course, because oils can damage them, and getting to study them, it was amazing. And so I spent this whole semester studying all about the Hashmoneans, all about their political strategy, how they're trying to portray themselves as like a revival of the Davidic kingdom, even though they're not Judites. or well, from the tribe of Judah, I should say. And then in like my personal devotional time, I was reading through, I think, the Gospel of Matthew at that point in time. And I read the verse where the blind man yells out in the middle of Jerusalem, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And I'm like, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Did he just say that in a loud voice in Jerusalem during the reign of Herod? Like, what? Well, okay. During the reign of Pilate would have been, strictly speaking. There was a brief window of time where Herod didn't have Judea. Anyway, yeah. So saying that, I mean, you think the situation is tense. Think about, places in our world today where there's these shaky relations, like, currently how the U.S. is with Russia. It's like we're back in the Cold War again, almost. It's like, do we need to do something about this? Let's wait and see. So it was that very tense political situation between the Jews and the Romans at that time. And by saying "Son of David" out loud, just that act alone could have started a revolution. Yes. So you can see why, this is why in the Gospels, I believe, Jesus is very careful about saying, hey, yes, I'm the Messiah, but don't go public with it just yet. Because he wanted to probably make clear what type of Messiah he was going to be before a revolution started. Because the Romans would have thought nothing about crucifying a few hundred or thousand Jews to keep the peace. So that is how archaeology can inform our perspective and realize, because we have posters on the walls of our homes and our churches with the names of God, the names of Jesus, and we don't think twice about, Jesus is the Son of David, so what? No, that was a revolutionary claim in that time. And so that's why Jesus is like, hey, my kingdom is not of this world. And he had to be very, well, I don't want to say he was careful. He knew what he was doing, right? He's God in the flesh. He knows what he's doing. But if the wrong people had gotten the wrong ideas, there would have been a massacre within seconds easily at any given point in time in Jesus' ministry. So that understanding that puts a whole new light on the Gospels and why Jesus said and did some of the things he did. Like the whole question, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. That's a brilliant response when you're on the brink of a revolution, which did happen in 70 AD. And that, of course, was just horrific. So it would have happened a lot sooner if people had gotten the wrong idea about Jesus.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I never thought about that being as the context for one of the reasons why Jesus did not reveal, his full identity.
Mm-hmm.
I would find, different reasons here and there, read or just understand by myself when studying the scriptures. But this is a really good cultural and historical context. So thank you for that. But when we're talking about some crucial findings that can strengthen our faith, I'm also reminded of the pagan findings of Yahweh being first mentioned, because we don't have, I think that it helps our faith to prove that, Yahweh is not just some deity that was evolved later in Jewish mythology, supposedly, as some skeptical scholars believe. So for me, that's also very important, especially when it comes to those who are not Jewish. They are not Christians, but we still find these findings. I think it was on a Moabite stone.
The Moabite stela, yes.
Yeah. So in your let's say vision when it comes to archaeology, especially biblical archaeology, what are your expectations in the next, let's say, 3, 4, 5 decades that we can look for maybe some new archaeological areas where Christian archaeologists or archaeologists in general plan to go and dig? You're much more acquainted with this than all of us.
Yes.
What is something that we can look forward, like, oh, I can't wait in 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 years when they plan to go dig this or dig that? are there any expectations to find something that will bring revolution for the whole civilization, not just for Christianity?
Well, that is a difficult thing to answer, because there are, it's all about methodology, I guess. Let me start here. So when you go into a site that has never been excavated before, you want to have some idea of what you might find. So you'll do like a survey of any surface finds. You usually have some idea that there's something to be found here before you just start digging. You don't just pick a random spot. You have to know at least a little bit about the area and what you might find. But you can't say for sure. There's some wonderful advances in ground penetrating radar, and also like it's called LiDAR, but you can use it from an airplane. And then there's drones now. There's even satellites that pick up interesting things. With that being said, you can't say for sure. Okay, you might say this is a large structure. Well, what is it? Until you start excavating and finding, okay, what's the nature of this large structure? What sort of finds are we finding within it? You can't really say what it is. And it's really bad methodology to be like, let me think of a fictional scenario. Let's say, okay, let's go with Robin Hood. Okay, we'll just say, what if Robin Hood had a fortress? Okay. And someone somewhere is like, Robin Hood is real. But let's say Robin Hood has a fortress, and English archaeologists think that it might be in this area. Okay, so they're going to go and excavate and find Robin Hood's fortress. That is fair enough. They think, okay, based on the text, we think it could be in this area. We're going to do some investigation and see if we're right. That is keeping an open mind. That is going off of the information you already have available. What would be a horrible methodology would be, well, the text says that Robin Hood has a fortress, so we're going to uproot the entire forest around Nottingham, and we're going to dig everything that looks remotely like it could be a pile of stones. And we're going to dig until we find it. Now, unfortunately, that was the attitude that a lot of very early archaeologists had when they were reading the Bible. They're like, well, the Bible says this site ought to be somewhere in this general area. So they dig, they find a site. They're like, oh, it must be this site. Well, the problem is, given the fact that our units of measurement are different than they used to be in the biblical times, maybe that, by the points of the compass, maybe it's 2 degrees west of the site you actually found is the actual site you were looking for. But you can't go in with a presupposition thinking, I want to find this and I'm going to find this. That is bad methodology. And it ended up causing a lot of embarrassment for the early generations of archaeologists, and actually giving more fodder to people who would want to say that the Bible can't be trusted. An example of this would be the conquest period, when the book of Joshua and the book of Judges talks about Israel coming into the land. So we know from other cultures, if Egypt, for instance, wants to come in and conquer an area, they usually had more of a scorched earth policy, depending on the area and the time period. So what we see is a lot of late bronze destructions from different pharaohs that are campaigning, like Thutmose III was one. I'd have to think to remember some of the others. I just wrote a paper on this, but Thutmose III is definitely one that comes to mind. So, you go in, you conquer a city, you burn it, you carry the people off as slaves, you slaughter everybody that, isn't valuable enough to be a slave in your opinion. And that shows them that Pharaoh is boss. You better not mess with him. But archaeologists go in and they decide, okay, well, obviously Israel must have done the same thing, right? Just scorched earth, burn everything, kill everybody. So when they're looking at the text of Judges and Joshua, they're thinking, why aren't we seeing these massive destruction layers with evidence of burning and destruction just everywhere? Every time that the Bible mentions the Israelites captured a city, why don't we see that level of destruction like you would for an Egyptian campaign? They failed to pay close attention. One of my professors pointed this out, Dr. Steve Ortiz. He said that he published an article talking about there's only, I want to say, about 7 sites that it specifically mentions that the Israelites burned when they conquered the cities. I could be getting that number wrong, so hopefully, I'm sure it will be corrected if I did get it wrong. But there were only a few sites, regardless, that were actually burned. Every other time, it talks about in the Bible that you're going to live in houses that you didn't build and harvest crops that you didn't plant. So that's the promise that God gives these people. They're not going to go in and burn down the houses that they want to live in. You're not going to have this total destruction policy if you're planning to occupy this area. Pharaoh doesn't care. Pharaoh goes home to Egypt and he has a lovely palace there. But the Israelites are wanting to occupy the land. So they're not going to burn crops and houses and everything. They're going to preserve them and just, get rid of the enemies that they encounter along the way. So that's why we don't see these major destruction layers for the conquest period. And there's even debate as to whether we should call it a conquest or something else, but hence the air quotes. But that is one of the things. But, these archaeologists went in thinking that they were going to find these major destruction layers. And when they didn't, all of their opponents are like, aha, the Bible isn't accurate. And it was just a misunderstanding of what they might find. There is this great quote. I mentioned Roland DeVoe. You can tell I fangirl over him a little. But he said in 1970, there should be no conflict between a well-established archaeological fact and a critically examined text. Meaning, and this is again one of the reasons why I tend to separate biblical studies from archaeology. It's like you've got them each in one hand. You have to understand what you're digging, but you also have to understand the text that you're reading. You have to examine both carefully with open hands, saying, and not say, oh no, I know everything there is to know about the Bible or everything there is to know about archaeology. You go in with that kind of attitude and you're going to get yourself in trouble pretty quickly. And there were some archaeologists that they began their career as believers in those early days, and they ended up as skeptics because they're like, well, archaeology, as I'm understanding it, doesn't prove the Bible as I understand it. So therefore, I guess I can't believe in the Bible anymore. And it's tragic because, like DeVoe said, if you just understand that maybe you're not seeing the full picture of one side or the other yet. Maybe you need to investigate more closely on either the text or the archaeological data and be careful before you just jump to a conclusion prematurely. That is the best practice as we know it in archaeology today, is to be careful before you draw conclusions. Now, because like I mentioned, archaeology is a discipline that is always changing as we're learning. 20 years from now, somebody could, if they still have the same technology, they could find this video, they could hear me saying that and be like, oh man, she was just, wow, that was the methodology back then. Wow, they had so much that they needed to learn. I'm completely okay with that. Those might be my students someday, honestly. But 20 years from now, we might know so much more. And that for me is the exciting thing. Like you mentioned, what's the exciting new thing that we're going to find? It's the knowledge. It's the development. It's the advancement of the field. It's a new technology that's coming out. We have technology now that is so exciting. What's next? I have no idea what could be more advanced in GPR and LiDAR and satellites. Like what are we going to come up with? Like little nanobots that we can insert into the soil? That would be fantastic. Somebody call Bill Gates on that. But the constant process of learning is what gets me excited. So that for me, it's like, I'm not like, oh my gosh, are we going to find X artifact? I mean, it would be great if we found the tomb of Alexander the Great. Like we have no idea where he ended up, but that for me would be fun. But it's just those developments. It's not knowing what we're going to find next that keeps me on my toes. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, that's a very good and detailed answer that would require so much thinking upon. So thank you about for that. When I'm thinking about myself, I don't see myself as an extremely um, adventurous person who will go exploring everything. But
Mhm.
still, I think if there is some quote unquote safe expedition to a certain place where you would be allowed to go and you know it's safe, including one of those deep caves where people found, especially in China, the biggest cave on the planet where it has
Mm,
its own like ecosystem and stuff. It's so deep, but I think it's safe to go because it's not just narrow channels where you go underground and maybe you know there may be um collapse of stones and just kill you, but this is like once when you go there it's so open, it's so wide, so I'm thinking that would be cool to go
mm,
and see.
absolutely.
And it's interesting how you mentioned that some people lost their faith because
Yes.
they don't find what they expected. And as we know, especially in the New Testament, we cannot diminish the role of the New Testament, who is
Mm,
of the I'm sorry of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, who is the one that convicts the sinner, who is the one who convicts the skeptic about the truth of Christianity, who
absolutely.
presses on the heart uh, and deals with issues of human, with each of us individually, which apologetics or archaeology cannot do. Simply, they don't have that power. It has to be the divine touch. But besides the work of the Holy Spirit, what do you think that biblical archaeology will have to find that many skeptics would say, hey, maybe
Mm,
there's something about Christianity.
mm,
Maybe this is something worth of me exploring. And you know, maybe their hearts and minds can start slowly changing so they can maybe not immediately convert, but at least start thinking more seriously you know, about Christianity.
mm. Well, that is a very involved topic. I will say that. So I have worked with people, even on sites within the biblical world, that they're not believers. So you can be an atheist, an agnostic, you know, new age, you know, you could be a non-believer and be working on a site that's associated with the older New Testament. Like Tel Gezer is mentioned in the Old Testament, for example. Of course, it's not called Tel, it's just called Gezer because the Tel refers to that building up of layers over time. So Gezer is mentioned in the Old Testament. Um, but you don't necessarily show up on site, see that it's here, oh my gosh, the Bible must be true. Now, what my non-Christian friends would probably agree to, and you know, you read enough articles long enough, you'd say, okay, they're probably be on board with this. Um, there are a lot of people who are skeptics who would affirm the historicity of certain aspects of the biblical text. Like, okay, we have sufficient archaeological data to show that this event actually happened, or that this character was a real historical person, or, you know, what have you. Um, Again, using Gezer because I'm more familiar with that one. Gezer is mentioned in the Bible. They found an inscription with the name Gezer on it. And so it's like you can't argue that, you know, it is pretty conclusively shown that Gezer is the same site that's mentioned in the Bible. So that's been pretty well established for over 100 years now. But there might be people who have worked at Gezer, who visited Gezer, who've read the literature about Gezer, who would say, okay, yes, that part of the Bible has some historicity, but all the parts where it talks about God doing supernatural things, or God talking to Solomon or to David or to Moses, all of that is just mythology. All of that is just made up. Um, and to that, I would say, okay, fair enough. What is the archaeology of a conversation between you and God. Like, you're not going to find anything that can prove that that conversation actually happened unless you find like maybe the stone tablets that Moses wrote, the Torah on. But yeah, so that is a problem. That is going to continue to be a problem, and that's only going to be, like you said, the work of the Holy Spirit. However, I would say that the best witness to a non-believing world, especially in my field, non-believing archaeologist, is Christian archaeologist. It's people who have their methodology down, like they've got solid methodology, they're reasonable, intellectual, wonderful people. And I know so many people who would fit that description. And they are also confessional Christians who believe what the Bible says is true. Because from an outsider's perspective, especially if you are, highly trained in academia, whether that's in textual criticism or if it's in archaeology, the perception is that if you've never met a Christian, you think that, we're all just some barefoot rednecks that just don't know any better, So when you find a Christian that has had a similar level of education as you, and they are sincerely a believer in spite of knowing, there could be some issues that we don't know about yet, like that causes people to stop and think, this is a person who's intelligent, but they're also a believer. I wonder why. And so I've had some wonderful conversations with non-believing friends, and I don't go into it like, okay, I've got a time crunch. I'm only here for 4 weeks. I've got to convert everybody before I go home. I never go in with that mindset because that's bad methodology for Christians. Instead, I'm like, it's that open-handed approach of, I'm just going to show up. I'm going to be myself, live out my faith to the best of my ability. And I know I'm not the best example of that all the time, because you get hot and sweaty and hangry, and, you're not always the best witness at that point in time. But that presents opportunities, because as you're digging in these essentially square holes in the ground, you're sweating right next to somebody who maybe has never heard the gospel. And, you can only talk about the weather for about 5 minutes before people get bored. You're working in the field for several hours at a time. You start talking about like, hey, so tell me about you, what's your story? And you start swapping stories with these people, and you get to know them, they get to know you. It's always hilarious to me. I'm going to tell on myself a little bit here. Anytime I go on a project where they don't know me already, and someone's like, oh, you're married, what does your husband do for a living? That is so funny to see people's reactions, where it's like, oh, my husband's a pastor. And everyone's like, and some people have kind of given me a little bit of space for a couple of weeks, because I guess they think that I'm going to, like, I don't know, smack them upside the head with a Bible if they, drop the F-bomb or something like that. And that's not who I am. So I recognize everybody has different views, different lifestyles, and I can disagree with somebody and still love them. And so I have wonderful friends that are from all different walks of life. And a lot of them I've met through archaeology, because it's a similar bond that you see between soldiers, actually, because if you've been through this, if you sweated together, you've been in the heat and the dust and everything together for so many days in a row, or weeks on end, or years, you're going to develop a very strong bond with those people, because you're having this common experience that is very intense sometimes. It can be dangerous. I had a friend that ended up cracking 3 ribs on a dig one time. This can be dangerous. So we look out for each other. We take care of each other. And it really doesn't matter to me if you're in my square and you believe completely differently than I do, I'm still going to take care of you if you're my colleague or my student that I'm teaching. Like, because I have had the privilege of having again, a lot of the early archaeologists were military. And so our command structure on site has some parallels. So it's like I've had a lower level supervisory position before, and I've been the one teaching people how you excavate. And it's like, if those are my volunteers that I'm responsible for, I'm the one teaching them, I'm the one taking care of them. It's like, yeah, I feel, a connection there that's very different than, just a casual person I meet on the street. So I would say, not just for archaeologists, but for everyone in all walks of life, if you are a believer, be a believer in your context, live out your faith, be the best witness you possibly can be. Not to say you have to put on a false persona, but be sincere about your faith in whatever context you find yourself in, and you'll have those sort of conversations around the water cooler or whatever. So that would be my response. I don't think it's going to be the finds that change the mind of skeptics. I think it's going to be the archaeologists ourselves and how we live our lives and act out our faith.
Yes, I would say amen. Thank you for that reminder, because even with all the diggings and findings and artifacts, if we are not living Christianity close to those co-workers who are atheists or skeptics or members of other religion, then what good is it for them to find any artifact? Because they can find artifacts for so many things in their life, but it won't change their heart.
Absolutely.
So that's a good one. We have come to the last section of the channel, and because of the name and the spirit of the channel, I'm the most excited about this part, because it deals not just with faith and archaeology, but also with some fringe parts. And I will start with the first question, which is, how are the archaeological findings of pagan idols and gods mentioned in the Bible important for biblical trustworthiness?
Okay. So when we find artifacts, let's say a common one for Israel is finding Baal statuettes, or my professor would, of course, correct me and be like, it's Baal. So I will try and use that pronunciation so he doesn't, correct me later. He's very gracious. Both of my professors are, but still, it's like, I gotta make him proud. So when we find little statuettes of Baal and we see that it's mentioned, especially like in 1st and 2nd Kings, it does lend credibility to the biblical text. Because if they mention that, okay, these people groups are worshiping this God and it's nowhere to be found, that could present a problem. But again, we haven't found everything yet. And if you read the biblical text, oftentimes idols could be made of wood. Wood is not very well preserved in that climate over thousands of years. So if the idol's made of wood, it's going to be gone. It's going to be barely detectable, maybe in soil samples, maybe. And that depends on the level of erosion and water flow through a site. So again, it's part of that. Okay, so what can we expect to find? Having those reasonable expectations. So I think it is like, going back to that Shakespearean play analogy, it's all part of the set design. So when we are finding out different things, maybe about, or, I love reading about Greek and Roman mythology. When we find a statue of Artemis, let's say, that helps us picture more in our minds what Paul's talking about when he's writing about, Luke wrote about Acts, and, there's this whole controversy about Diana of the Ephesians, which it mentions silversmith specifically there. Silver, if the idol's made of silver, silver can be melted down and reused. if that idol's no longer worshipped, or if it gets damaged in some way, it probably got melted down. Metal was so precious in the ancient world that they didn't just toss it out if they could possibly reuse it. So that's why a lot of metal artifacts aren't preserved. Plus, again, preservation, if the soil composition is the wrong mix for whatever that metal is, it can erode to the point where it's hardly anything left. It's unrecognizable at some points. And that presents a challenge, of course, for conservationists. But so finding out even pagan related things, like whether it's a temple or an idol or an inscription, it can help us understand what the Bible's talking about. Like, for instance, you see all the prophets like just talking about all this idol worship. And sometimes they'll say a reference like the Queen of Heaven, for instance, which is, I think it's traditionally interpreted to be Asherah, if I remember correctly. Well, we wouldn't know who the Queen of Heaven is, depending on your theology, you might think that's the Virgin Mary. But of course, that's in the Old Testament. So what the heck? What are they talking about? So you can get in some very weird conspiracy theory type ideas if you don't understand what they're actually talking about. So that's where you have to look up, okay, when he uses this phrase, what did it mean in that time? And you have to look at those pagan sources sometimes to be like, oh, okay, that was an epithet of this god or goddess. I was reading just the other day about how there's Psalms that talk about, the terror by night. And some scholars believe that that is actually a reference to certain Babylonian demons that were believed to stalk at night and come into houses and kill children and do horrible things. So, and if you think about before street lights and electricity, the ancient world was literally a very dark place. You'd have your little lamp, your little campfire, and everything beyond that circle of light was incredibly dark, especially if there's no moon. If it's a cloudy night or it's a new moon, it's incredibly dark. So, and I actually have a friend who's doing some research about light in the ancient world. So I'm very excited to see her findings on that. But yes, understanding these other cultures, even if we're not agreeing with them, and even if we're not worshiping the gods that they worship, we still should understand what's going on there because it can inform the biblical text. It's almost like, so with the prophets, think of it as somebody's on the phone, but you're only hearing half of the conversation. You have to know what the other person's saying to be able to know what those responses are. You only get so much from half of a conversation. And I would say these pagan sources and the pagan archaeology is the other half of the conversation a lot of times.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have the longest question that is actually not that difficult, but it's the longest question I wrote so far. In your studies thus far, did you find out that reading some extra biblical as well as mythological data and their later excavations have made you connect some dots when reading the Bible better than before, and perhaps help you to see the bigger picture more clearer than before?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned this today, but this morning our speaker was talking about Genesis chapter 3, and I very deliberately usually do not bring my study Bible to church because I get sidetracked reading the study notes, and then I go on a research binge finding up all the other references. And so the study notes in my Bible, it wasn't even the passage he was talking about, but for the next passage over, it references Sumerian king list. And I'm like, I'm not as familiar. That's out of my time frame, because that that's even before Abraham, depending on where you date Abraham. So I was like, okay, I'm aware of it, but what are they getting at with this footnote? So I start looking up on my phone. I'm literally, I hate to admit this, but I was Googling some basic information about the Sumerian king list and like, how can I get my hands on a copy of that to do some deeper study? And I had to confess to our speaker, who's one of our deacons, I had to confess that I missed the first half of his sermon because I was so busy doing research on the Sumerian king list. And I'm like, and this is why I don't bring my study Bible to church most days. So he was fine with it, of course. He loves going down research rabbit trails too. But this was something, because he was talking about the length of the lifespans in the genealogies in Genesis and how that compares to the Sumerian king list. And I was like, wait, that would be a really fun thing to research. Now I have to look it up. And if it takes me 10 years to write my dissertation, just know it's because I went on all these different rabbit trails that had nothing to do with my dissertation topic. I have to restrain myself a lot with that. But yes, that's an example, even just today, how comparing extra biblical sources to the biblical text can help us understand what's going on there. And there's so many other examples of that. We could talk about that all day, but that's just one easy example of something that happened to me today. And my husband teases me when I get in research mode, because it's like, I react very viscerally to stuff if I get excited. So it's like, all of a sudden I'm reading the Bible, following along, and it's like my eyes just get big. I'm like, I think I might have actually gasped, and like immediately pull out my phone and start researching. And so I'm like, hopefully I wasn't too disruptive to everyone else who was actually listening to the sermon. But yeah, when you get so excited about Bible study that you miss half the sermon, that is my life. That is me. This is why I can't have my study notes in church.
Can I ask you, because you mentioned a couple of times that there are different dates when it comes to Abraham, which I understand. There are dates not just about Abraham, but about different Old Testament characters, which more conservative Christians hold usually to be older, and they're more, if I can say, newer dates when it comes to the scholars who are either skeptics, or I won't necessarily call them liberal Christians. But
Yes.
in your, what is your stand on Abraham? Even though I didn't even think about asking this question, if I'm not wrong, I think from in our Old Testament class at Moody, our professor mentioned something like 2000 BC. Is that, or maybe even a little bit older, maybe 100 or something like that? I can't remember. This was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
But is that something that you hold to this day, to the same date?
I would be interested to know like what the criteria was for his dating of Abraham, because I actually had to look up my chronological chart over here. So if I'm understanding you correctly, he would date Abraham the early Bronze Age, which would be about 2000 to about 1500 BC, depending on chronology. Is a big deal in archaeology. Everyone's debating, is it this time frame? Is it 100 years earlier, 500 years later? The further back you go, the broader the ranges tend to be as far as give or take this time frame. Now, I personally, off the top of my head, I can't remember all the data points on that, but I have been taught by my professors and with fairly convincing data interpretations that Abraham is probably could be considered about 1500 BC, or the Middle Bronze Age, probably towards maybe the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. So I would say somewhere around maybe 1500 BC as kind of a general ballpark figure. Can we narrow it down any further? I don't think we can, because again, Abraham was a nomad. He's not going to leave like big, massive buildings behind because he's traveling around in a tent. So we can't really narrow it down any further than that. All we can do is look at the text, look at what it mentions, and then look at the actual archaeology and say, okay, so it mentions Abraham is visiting this city, and that city was around for a very long time. So, okay, somewhere within this range, maybe. Or one of the things that, for me personally, I found a convincing argument for dating Abraham somewhere around early Middle Bronze Age, was the interactions he had with Egypt. Because back in the fall semester of last year, so it's been almost a year ago now, I did a paper about the interactions between Egypt and Semitic peoples, which would include the Amorites and Abraham and the Israelites. And it wasn't some of my best work because, I feel like I could have done a better job. I'm sure my professor would agree with that. But it was fun for me to play around with the source material and to try and understand what's going on with that dynamic. And what I personally found from my research was that the Middle Bronze Age makes sense for Abraham because that was a time frame where the Semitic people are coming and going out of Egypt all the time. It's a common thing. And a lot of times it was because there was some kind of famine, or maybe they're traders and they're bringing different products to Egypt. So with that coming and going, that very open border type policy that was going on in the Middle Bronze Age, I feel like that reflects what we see in the patriarchal stories. Now, earlier and later, it's not quite as open because there's different political things going on with Egypt. So yes, I would say somewhere in the Middle Bronze Age is what I'm comfortable dating Abraham. But if somebody's like, hey, he's actually the last phase of the early Bronze Age, okay, maybe I could see that too.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure 100% because this was like 4 years ago. And Moody's conservative college, so it
Of
makes
course, yeah.
sense. Maybe I made mistake. Maybe he was saying something like closer to you. I was just curious, what is your
Oh
stand?
yeah,
Because,
absolutely.
like you said, I know that many scholars, many historians see different chronologies at
Yes.
different times. So this is, I think, a big um, topic where different scholars argue, which is not so important for us tonight. I was just curious.
Yes.
It's so interesting that you mentioned King's List because this is the book I
Yes.
wanted to recommend
Yes.
to our viewers, and I know that you liked it. It's
Mm-hmm.
Zondervan, a Handbook of Biblical Archaeology. I
Mm-hmm.
actually skimmed and read some pages without just
Mm-hmm.
skipping. Like I did like the first 100 pages, so I can be somewhat prepared better for today. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember reading the chapter about the Sumerian king list, which is very interesting because you just
Yes.
mentioned it, and
Mm-hmm.
the author mentioned who is Randolph Price. He
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that the Bible talks about a couple of kings from the Sumerian kings list, and of course they may not agree with
Mm-hmm.
uh, the Bible and the Sumerian kings list may not agree with the length of their lives
Mm-hmm.
because one of the kings in that Sumerian list lived over 40,000 years. But
Yes.
it also the author made a comment that to this day we do not understand how Sumerians calculated years.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
So that's something that, I get that question a lot from our youth group, and some adults in the church as well. And wow, how did people end up living hundreds of years, before the flood? And, there are different explanations. And one thing that I've just from my own research have started to speculate on lately is, well, how long's a year? Everyone has a different calendar system. And it wasn't until, much later that they started understanding like, well, what's a solar year versus a lunar year. And so before the first people discovered what a solar year was, how did they count years? I have no idea. That would be a wonderful area of research. And hopefully somebody will find some developments. That would be a discovery that I would be like, yes, we know it now, but we don't know yet. So, yeah, like you're saying, I was glancing over the Sumerian king list this morning and saying, wow, this is not just hundreds of years. This is tens of thousands of years. This is wild. And what is a year anyway to them? So we don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah, and even though the oldest people mentioned in the Old Testament were up to 1,000 years, and here we see the cases of even up to 40,000. Randall Price makes a statement that despite the difference, we can see how there's a commonality between the Bible and the Babylonian religion. I mean, there are more similarities in all these religions and mythologies, but even despite this difference, that you can see they had some common things or things in common, and this was one of them to not just calculate how how their important people, patriarchs or kings or whoever, lived long, but also that it could be leading to the truth. I mean, I'm not buying 40,000 years, but that people had this longevity because of certain lifestyle and nature, and maybe oxygen more, and Christian scientists are dealing more with it. So I'm not, I cannot speculate too much or speak from my mind if I didn't study, so I don't want to sound ignorant. But I just found that interesting. And I waited for almost 2 hours to ask the question of all the questions that I've been waiting.
I know which one you're going to ask. I know which one. Okay, go ahead.
Well, please give me some exciting, encouraging news when I'm asking you about the giant bones that were supposedly found in the last century or 2 centuries throughout the world, in the States and in every continent. Is there any truth to that? Because according to the oldest newspapers from the late 19th century, America was booming. The same thing, not just with gold rush, not just it was booming with gold rush, but in the same fashion, it was booming with all these findings of supposedly giants, skeletons and bones. And our beloved late Dr. Heiser, when he was addressing that, he said, he thought that was fake because people had to make newspaper headlines like that would sound so much interesting that people would buy newspapers. So that really made me disappointed. So I was like, okay, let me ask Becca. Maybe she has something, because I remember seeing some photos online, and then later, oh, these were like Photoshop. When you see archaeologists bending down and cleaning all these bones are actually enlarged. I was like, dang it, too. So I was like, please, Becca, give us something good.
Oh, I hate to break it to you, but okay. First, let's understand, like I said, the nature of archaeologists. We get so excited when we find stuff that's cool. We actually have some protocols in place to prevent it leaking before it's supposed to. Okay. So on site, like the first thing that you learn is protocol is don't just take a picture of the finds and post it to your social media before it's been officially announced by the excavation. And that's because modern excavations do involve like government agencies, maybe the director of the excavation will inform the government agency, and the government agency will be the one to leak the news that, hey, we found this wonderful thing. Or maybe it's the university that's sponsoring the dig. But if you've got a student that just snaps a picture and posts it on their Instagram, that is very much a no-no. And it's something that we're told in no uncertain terms is not okay. And most of the time you don't have like Wi-Fi or data out on site anyway. But we're taught that there is a process for making these finds public, but it tends to happen, especially if it's a really fascinating find, it tends to happen very quickly. We found last summer a beautiful marble statue on our site, and within a couple of days, the news went out, or maybe it was a couple of weeks, but it was very quickly after the discovery, the proper organizations came out with the announcement, hey, we found this wonderful Greek style, but Roman period probably, but I can't say for sure because I'm not an expert in sculptural styles. But Um, yes, we found this wonderful marble sculpture. So somewhere in the Greco-Roman time frame. Um, so there's a process for making finds public, but we want to make finds public because, for one thing, the whole purpose of archaeology is to educate people. And every archaeologist that I know is passionate about educating the public, whether that's within the church or just the public in general. So if they find something as awesome as a 10-foot skeleton or bigger, you better believe that they're going to have it on display at the museum. They're going to, it's going to be written about in all of the journal articles. It's going to be in all the books. It would have been talked about and presented to the public very clearly. And the fact that you can't go to Chicago, the Chicago Museum, and see it on display kind of indicates that there's nothing to display. We're not trying to keep everything hush hush. Why would we do that? Because we want our schools and our museums to get funding from the government, from the Rockefellers used to fund excavations, So you want your finds to become public so there's interest so that you can keep doing what you love to do. So I hate to break it to you, but to my knowledge, there is no giant skeleton lurking in the basement of a museum anywhere that I've ever heard of. So if I find one, I'll let you know, but sorry.
Yeah, I love watching archaeological findings and different videos. They're sometimes mixed with some mysterious stuff that people post throughout the world. Um, and on different channels, these are not Christian archaeologists, but the authors of these channels who produce videos about cool findings throughout the world. You usually don't see them; you just hear their voice because they're just narrating, making videos, and moving on. But I heard so many times that Smithsonian Museum has kept all of these giant bones, and the reason why they don't want to expose them in museums is because if they do that, they will prove the Bible is true. And of course, as a secular institution, it goes against their agenda. And when I was not that not that not that long ago, I used to believe in that. So I was younger, but not that younger. I was like, oh yeah, it sounds like one. Even though I hate conspiracies, I was like, well, this conspiracy kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
If it's conspiracy, I don't know. So according to your understanding, there's probably nothing that Smithsonian is hiding because they never got any giant bones probably in the first place. Huh?
I think it was Ben Franklin that said, three can keep a secret if two of them are dead. So we have dozens of people who work on archaeological digs. Even 100 years ago, cameras were a thing. People would write in their journals, they would send letters home. If there had been something of that nature that was found, it would have been almost impossible for somebody to cover it up for this long. Not to mention the fact, like I said, the motive is not to cover it up. The motive is to share the knowledge with the world. And so I hear stories like that. I hear, there's all sorts of hoaxes that come up that have been debunked. And some of those old hoaxes are resurfacing because of TikTok. I've had several people send me videos that they've seen on TikTok where, this stuff got debunked in the 1980s, but we didn't have TikTok back then. So now it's a new sensational. They don't want you to know. If you hear somebody say they don't want you to know this, but that's probably a pretty good indication that everything afterwards is just, no, it's probably not accurate at all. In my experience, anyway.
Yeah, I was also disappointed a little bit. I mean, I can't be too disappointed, but I was checking out this book and then I looked for the part in the Old Testament, when it comes to giants or Genesis 6, 1 to 4. I was like, hey, maybe they have some data that is hard to find. So maybe, Randall Price has some, insight that we don't have, and I didn't find anything. And I was disappointed. But then, like I told you earlier today, well, of course he didn't put anything because by doing that, he may have ruin his work and discredit himself as the archaeologist. The whole name, maybe people will be mocking book. And of course, as a Christian, he doesn't want just Christians to buy and read this book, but just
Mhm.
anyone. So in that
Yeah.
regard, I also understand. But I'm just curious: is there a possibility? I mean, okay,
Mhm.
maybe that's a wrong beginning of the question. Of course, there is always a possibility. But when it comes to these bones, they will have to be old thousands of years.
Mhm.
Can bones uh, be sustained for that long,
Mhm.
that they would still survive? Because, as we know, our ancestors, once when they're buried in the graves, and they open their graves maybe in 50 years, to if
Mhm.
they're like doing something with the cemetery, sometimes you don't even see the bones. They're like turned into dust.
Right.
So I'm
Right.
just curious, like, what are the chances for bones that will be old for thousands of years to even survive?
Well, that's a good question. So it depends on the soil acidity and the level of humidity in that climate. So if you're in a climate that has the wrong chemical composition, bones can deteriorate completely, or they can be so badly damaged that there's only like the most dense bones that are found. So that can be a problem. But also, I think, again, it goes back to our expectations. Um, when you look at, and this varies based on population, but the average person in these time periods might not have been as tall as we are. There are ways of estimating how tall people are. And so if the tallest guy you know is about 5'5", you get somebody who's the size of an NBA player, like, there's 7 foot, that is going to be a giant. So maybe they're not 14 feet tall, maybe they're 7 feet tall. Maybe they have that pituitary issue that causes that growth where they're just taller than the average person, but maybe it's something like that. I don't know. Now, that's not to say that there couldn't also be supernatural explanations for it as well, but like how we define a giant might not be like what they would define a giant as. So again, it's that expectation. And also, um, so like I said, we go back to that layer cake. That date for those remains, if they exist, will be all the way on the bottom layer. It'd be all the way at the bottom. And who knows what's out there? That's the exciting thing. This is why I used to still love Star Trek, is that sense of exploration. I used to watch Star Trek as a kid, and I blame that mostly for why I got into archaeology, because it's that anything could be out there, within reason, of course. So far, we haven't found any alien spaceships on any of the digs that I've been involved with, so I will put that out there. But yeah, there's this sense of who knows what's next, and there's an excitement about that.
When it comes to Indiana Jones, I believe all of us loved him when we were growing up and watching his movies.
Mhm.
And when it comes to the Christian archaeologists, which are the Christian archaeologists? They're a type of Indiana Jones, like famous and good, and their work is amazing. Maybe Randall Price, I don't know if he fits in that category, but can you please name a few so that anyone who is interested in this topic, they can go and maybe Google their books, they can watch their websites, maybe read their articles, and things of that sort.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So, you had sent me the list of questions that we would be discussing so I could get prepared, and I found that one funny because every archaeologist who has been alive and in archaeology since the Indiana Jones movies first premiered, we all secretly want to be Indiana Jones, even while we recognize that he would have horrible mythology if he was a real person. So we like the character and the adventure of it. And speaking for myself as a kid, when I first watched them, it wasn't so much about the punching Nazis and all that sort of thing. I was fascinated by the fact that he could speak all these ancient languages, like he could read them and speak them, and just knew all this historical data off the top of his head. And so after I spent like a year studying archaeology, I rewatched my favorite Indiana Jones movie, and going in thinking, okay, it's Hollywood, it's not going to be accurate. He mentions Petrie digging at Tanis, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Petrie really did dig at Tanis. And so that was my moment of, okay, the one accurate thing I can point to in this movie is that he mentions Petrie at Tanis. But so if you have a positive view of Indiana Jones, taking all of the methodology aside, some of the archaeologists who have been so instrumental in developing the field. I've already mentioned Roland DeVoe at least twice, probably 3 times now. Roland DeVoe is a good one. W.F. Albright is basically the father of biblical archaeology, so he's definitely a person that people should know. Now, since he is such an early figure, a lot of his theories and findings, we've since learned that he didn't quite get all of his interpretations correct, but he's still, you got to start somewhere. And he was brilliant for his time. He just didn't dig all the way through the layer cake yet. That's the nature of archaeology. You got to be willing to be proven wrong by the next generation. It is how it is. So he's also very good one. Like I mentioned, McFadden, I think his first name was George. I could be getting that wrong, but McFadden, if you look up McFadden in Cyprus, you're going to find him. He's the one with the sailboat and the adventure on the high seas. And, so that's definitely one to look into. I don't know if you knew this, but Agatha Christie actually was married to an archaeologist as her second husband. She wrote a book called Come Tell Me How You Live, I believe. I think that's right. But if you look up Agatha Christie and archaeology, you'll find it. And it's this wonderful look about what life was like when she accompanied her husband on digs. So those are some of the old ones that are no longer with us. Modern day archaeologists that are still in the field now that I got to give some shout outs to people. It feels like the Academy Awards. My professors are amazing. Stephen Ortiz and Tom Davis. They have been in the field longer than I've been alive, and they will not thank you if you remind them of that. So they're excellent, very well respected. Yossi Garfinkel is another good one. Sam Wolf is a good one. He actually worked at Gezer. Who else? Jody Magnus. Oh my gosh, I fangirl over Jody Magnus. I actually have one of her books I was going to recommend. But anything Jody Magnus writes, you should read it. She is not a believer. She's Jewish. And I'm trying to remember like if she's practicing Jewish or culturally Jewish, there's a distinction. But if Jody Magnus wrote it, take it to the bank. Another person to look at is Kitchen on the reliability of the Old Testament. Kitchen is good. He's more along the Egyptology side of things, but he can play in any space he wants to because he's that good. Redford is another good Egyptologist. James Hoffmeyer actually trained my Egyptology professor, who's Dr. Mark Jansen. So that's a whole lot of names. But let's see, who else am I forgetting? Dr. Laura Swantak is one of the best field archaeologists that I have ever seen, and she's amazing. I know I'm currently reading through her master's thesis. I need to get a copy of her dissertation, but she's brilliant. I love her. My generation, there are a couple, let me make sure I get the names of their stuff right. I had it right here in my notes. So one of my classmates has a YouTube channel called Just So You Know. It's very well done. Her name is E.R. Brown. I love her. She's amazing. Beneath the Bible with Philip Webb, Lucas Grimsley, and Kyle Bowman. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't know Kyle personally, but I've worked with Phil and Lucas, and they're really great. So if somebody's interested in like how Indiana Jones developed as a mythology, there's a really great podcast that I don't know the guy personally, but I really enjoyed it. Indiana Jones in History by Justin M. Jacobs. He actually does Chinese archaeology, so he comes at it from a very different perspective than I'm used to, and it was a pleasure listening to that. But those are some names you should know, some resources. Let me give you just a couple more. This, hopefully you can see it, Biblical Archaeology Review. Okay, this is kind of the dust jacket of it, but I just wanted to point out, I'm so proud of her, but E.R. Brown is right there on the cover. So she's got her YouTube channel. And there's been some friendly kidding, but, Jody Magnus right there. My professor, he doesn't get his picture on it, like right here. He's down here in the credits section. So he's like, my own student upstaged me, but it's still, he's very proud, I can tell. But Biblical Archaeology Review is an excellent magazine to get into if you want to just see what's out there, see who's digging where. Every summer or every spring, usually, they come out with a edition of the magazine that's all about what digs are going to be going into the field in the summer. So it's a wonderful resource. But if I had to say my number one resource that everybody should have, Nicola, this is something that we talked about before we went live. It's going to be the ESV Archaeology Study Bible, which you have a copy of. I think it's so great that you do. If I could have every Christian in every church in America have a copy of this book, this would be the book. Okay, because it is an excellent study Bible. This was a study Bible. I am so sorry, Greg. This is a study Bible that got me distracted during your sermon today. I'm sorry, but it's great. You should read it. So I honestly, like, if I had the money, I would be buying like dozens of copies to give away. But I don't. I'm a PhD student. I don't have that kind of funds. So those are some who's who and resources that people should check out. So.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot of sources that hopefully some of our viewers will be using. And
I had to exercise restraint not to give more, so I hope you appreciate that.
Oh wow! Okay. Well, you know what? How about we having concluding thoughts now, and then in the future making another video where we can talk either about archaeology or about, because I know you mentioned in the private chats something about mythologies that you also love and you learn about that. So I'm looking forward, honestly, about our next session, because this was very educational for all of us. I never had archaeologists on the channel, like I said, and that makes even more precious to all of us who are learning and watching all of this. And I thank you for your time. I know we went a little bit above 2 hours. I'm sorry for that, but I enjoyed. Really, you gave us so much information, so much data. I'm really thankful for your time. And yeah, like I said, do you have any concluding thoughts for our viewers? It can be anything regarding biblical archaeology.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I recognize that not everybody is familiar with archaeology, and it can be tricky sometimes when you're trying to learn about the archaeology of the Bible to know what's a good resource and what's not. Don't let that stop you. Don't let that embarrassment or that fear of drifting into the wrong territory, don't let that stop you from getting started. The resources I recommended are a great place to start, but you can always go further and deeper beyond that. It is definitely worth it to learn about archaeology and how it connects to the Bible. It has helped me so much in my own faith and Christian walk, and to the point where I think I mentioned earlier that I taught Sunday school this morning. My archaeological background makes me a better Sunday school teacher. And I would say, if you are called to ministry in any form, learning about archaeology could do the same for you.
That's amazing. Since I just started volunteering with the youth, in the future, if they put me to start teaching them and I go a little bit nerdy, I may actually ask you for some of the notes that you've been preparing for either Old or in the future for the New Testament. But Becca, it's been an absolute pleasure. I thank you for your time. I thank for all the viewers who kept themselves busy by watching us over 2 hours. I'm looking forward again when it comes to the next session. We'll make that schedule. I wish you a blessed rest of the evening and the new week. And yeah, I wish all of you, dear viewers, a wonderful week. Thank you for staying with us. And please, because our channel is still new, help us spread the word. Like, share, subscribe, all the stuff that you already know. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you.